Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and your second of your two Thanksgiving flips, right? Your second of your two Thanksgiving flips. No, it's mine. Now. Sorry, he really wants this thing really, really bad. So anyway, your second of your two Thanksgiving flips that we're going to be trying to remember, keep to about 25 minutes or under and stuff like that, so y'all can hang out, enjoy time with your families, but we just cannot miss this many days of school and not stay on top of our actual content and stuff like that, because a whole week off is a lot of time off, right? So the big thing about it, though, is we left off in our last flip talking about the late Enlightenment thinkers, right? And I was trying my best to explain Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that Swiss, the Swiss philosopher from that clock-making family and things like that, who actually came from Geneva, Switzerland, in a very sober town, and really kind of began to mock the grandioseness of Paris after he moved there, right? Not too dissimilar from Baron de Montesquieu in the way that he also similarly mocked Parisian society in his Persian letters, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is that Jean-Jacques Rousseau did go down a different path, and he began to kind of say that society was the worst thing that's ever happened to people, right? That human beings have become more obsessed with a love of themselves than a love of the community, right? Well, actually the other way around. It's weird. Like I said, it's hard to explain. And I'm going to drop a video down in the description below that really does a great job of slowly explaining all of Rousseau's ideas, right? But the biggest one that he comes along with is that idea that society has ruined humanity, right? And that we need to try and move away from it, and that the best of all possible worlds, which is a quote from Candide by Voltaire, but don't get that confused. So the best of all possible worlds is human beings living at one with nature, and one with their feelings, and one with their love and emotions and stuff like that, out in the woods by themselves. But he was like, you know what? The chances of that happening is pretty slim to none, right? So he actually wrote his book called The Social Contract, and that is his biggest text, right? His most famous text, which some historians may argue with that assumption and stuff like that, but I believe it's his most famous text, that one that says, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. It alludes to his idea of the general will, which is the most important thing you need to know about Rousseau. The general will is the idea that if people come together in a society that they are forced to kind of being one with, right? Because we're not all going to move out into the woods, but if we are in societies, we need to come together and debate and then direct democracy vote on things, and what everyone else is feeling, majority rules, is basically the general will, right? And that the general will is never wrong. Now, the hard part about it is that the general will is going to then later on be co-opted and used into things like totalitarianism in World War II, because, a lot of people agreed with Hitler, but he was still evil and disgusting and awful, right? So the biggest thing about it, though, is Rousseau did have some decent ideas, right? The general will works maybe 7 times out of 10, right? 7 times out of 10, the idea of everybody coming together, debating, discussing, and talking about their ideas usually works, right? But the problem is it's not going to always work, right? Well, now another good idea he had was his ideas on education. He believed that children should be educated from a young age, right? And actually learn practical skills like reading and writing and gardening and things like that, so they can actually foster young mindful development. That's a really good one. He wrote that book and wrote about that in his book called Emmanuel, right? He had another one where he said basically people should choose marriage for love rather than choosing marriage by an economic arrangement, right? There was this very famous book he wrote called Julie that actually talks about a woman that was in love with her tutor rather than the man that she was being arranged to marry, and it actually painted her love of this tutor as a very beautiful thing, and it's going to begin to push people towards marrying for love rather than marrying for an economic situation. So another good idea that he had was basically the idea that mankind has really, really come down in a lot of negative ways, right? He's being very critical. He had some terrible ideas, though, too, and I think his terrible ideas are more overwhelming than his good ideas. He had some really terrible ideas about race and slavery, which is absolutely disgusting. So, Rousseau, you are in the back of my bookshelf because of that, right? And then also another big one is that he had really negative views on women. He believed that women were completely dependent on men, and he believed that a man could survive without a woman, but a woman did not need a man, right? And I know I talked about this stuff in the beginning of the end of the last one and stuff like that. Just wanted to review it a little bit and stuff like that. But don't worry, a lot like Voltaire, we will bring up Jean-Jacques Rousseau again, right? But remember, his big things are his book called The Social Contract, The General Will, and his good and terrible ideas, right? So the thing about it, though, going forward is we have one last philosopher we need to kind of gloss over a little bit, and his name is Immanuel Kant, right? So Immanuel Kant is a Prussian man who tried to balance the ideas of a good absolutist, right? He's the very first person to come around in the mid 1700s efforts to begin to try and define what a good, enlightened absolutist is, right? He looked at like the Machiavellian description of a ruler, and he was like, look, there are a lot of great ideas about rulers out there, right? But what is a truly enlightened ruler like, right? What is the enlightened ruler that is taking the ideas of the Enlightenment and making society better? What does he look like? What does that sound like? What does his rulership look like, right? And he also was the very first person to kind of define the Enlightenment, right? He kind of gave the Enlightenment period a name. No one had ever sat there when Voltaire was walking around and be like, this is the Enlightenment, right? Emmanuel is going to be the guy that comes along, this Prussian philosopher, and he kind of defines it. And he talked about in his essay, what is the Enlightenment? And he said it is saper audur, which means dare to know, right? The idea of growing human reason is never a bad thing, right? Of growing intellect is never a bad thing. And that the best of all possible situations is us trying to get smarter and daring to know, right? He also wrote on the decline of religion and the ability of individual reasoning, right? He basically said that the downfall of religion as an overarching theme that controls your life, going down is a good thing, right? That it's going down is actually, it's making it more so like the Catholic Church is more of something you practice in your heart rather than something you have to performatively practice in society. He kind of really echoed a lot of the things that Voltaire said, because Voltaire was very prominent for saying, your religion belongs to you. It does not need to be like aware to everybody else, right? And also he wrote on the ideas of individual reasoning and the ideas that the human brain can do a lot of amazing things, right? Now, looking at this entire thing, though, something else you need to understand, so we got to talk about our enlightened absolutists, right? We got three big absolutists and two big absolutists, one big absolutist family that we got to kind of go over a little bit, right? The enlightened absolutists are this idea that some of these rulers are going to take that top-down approach to the Enlightenment. And to be completely honest, the only way that the Enlightenment was going to spread into society effectively was going to be from that top-down approach, right? The idea that it's going to start with the monarchy and then it's going to begin to move its way down, right? Into the nobles and the aristocracy, into the gentry and the middle class, and then into the peasantry, right? And we saw that with the salons. We saw that going from salon to coffee house to pamphlets and public readings, right? We saw that going from the ideas of people being exposed to it in wealthy society and it moving its way down. Now, the thing about it is Immanuel Kant's ideas, though, are going to come along, and it's going to begin to define the idea that how can an enlightened absolutist, how can a beautiful, benevolent, good king or leader spread these ideas intentionally? How can they actually practice the ideas of the Enlightenment? And that's where we get our very big concept of the enlightened absolutist / the enlightened despot, okay? Because I got a couple question marks in here, right? The enlightened absolutist is supposed to be a benevolent ruler, right? A benevolent meaning good, a good, all-loving ruler that adopted the ideas of progress, rationalism, and tolerance. But the thing about it in general is like the enlightened absolutists were really, really great if you were in these two classes. But if you were in this bottom one down here, you didn't really reap the rewards and benefits of the Enlightenment until after the revolutions began. And even like later on, you got just kind of reinstated back into the same old ways, right? So the thing about it going forward, though, is we got to start off our enlightened absolutist discussion with this guy, right? He's the Prussian leader, right? His name is Frederick II, who is a Hohenzollern. We talked about Prussia and stuff like that, so we know he's going to be militaristic and things like that. But he's also got a nickname. He's Frederick the Great, all right? In German, he's known as Frederick der Grosse, all right? So der Gross means great or large, and so Frederick der Grosse, he also had a nickname, der Alte Fritz, which because he was an older man by the time that he started doing a lot of his most promising work. And der Alte Fritz means the old Fritz, right? Like, so, like, basically referring to him as the old guy that was, like, very, very, like, prominent in the palace and stuff like that, and also, oh, good old Fritz, right? So now the thing about it, though, is he is a very prominent leader, right? And Frederick the Great is going to be a good example to start off with in enlightened absolutism, because he kind of mirrors the ideas of he tried to do his best, but he didn't do enough, right? I think that's a big thing that we need to focus on here. Tried to do your best, but didn't do enough, right? So like now, so with that, he is the son of Frederick I, that guy, the soldier king, right? Well, Frederick William I, right? Frederick William I, not Frederick I. Frederick I is actually his grandfather. That's a typo. It's supposed to be Frederick William I, the soldier king, and then he becomes Frederick II because the very first king of Prussia was actually Frederick I, his grandfather, not that's Frederick William's dad. Don't let that confuse you. Everybody in Prussia is named Frederick or Frederick William, all right? So, like, now, and I apologize for that, or Frederick or William or all these other people, right? So the thing about it is he is the son of the soldier king, the Soldatenkönig, right? The guy that kind of adopted the idea that Prussia was hatched out of a cannonball, right? Well, a thing you need to know about Prussia and under Frederick the Great and stuff like that is he's going to do a lot to really put Prussia on the map as a very powerful, dominant country in like European politics. He's going to double Prussia's population and size when he invades a place in Austria known as Silesia, right? Okay, now we're going to talk a lot more on that later, but something that you need to kind of understand is that was a big reason why he was considered that enlightened absolutist, right? He was trying to grow Prussia's landholdings to make them a dominant, large country in Europe, right? And also, while he does this, he will not actually infringe upon the religious rights of the people there because most people in Silesia were Catholic, right? And he actually said, no, keep practicing your Catholicism. Knock yourself out. And he welcomed religious outcasts. Huguenots from France were allowed to immigrate to Prussia. He's going to pick up on the same ideas that his father did, right? And he's going to grow the Prussian army to a standing army of 200,000. Now, granted, with a population as small as theirs is, 200,000 standing army is the size of Peter the Great's army in Russia. Now, most of the countries in Europe had grown larger armies and stuff like that, but this is what Prussia's going to look like after he invades Silesia. Now, when we looked at it on our old absolutism map, when you were working on your project, I know Stella knows this, right? Prussia was kind of this little chunk right here and this little chunk over here. Well, Silesia is this chunk right there. That's what he invaded and actually gobbled up, and he's going to help double their population. Now, later on, he's going to connect these two things in 1772 when he actually invades some other areas and they begin to partition Poland. Now, that's going to be a big thing to keep in the back of your mind. Just remember the partitioning of Poland. I need to remember the partitioning of Poland. My name is insert AP student here, partitioning of Poland, right back here, right? So now the thing about it, though, going forward is that you need to understand that he's also going to do something that no monarch had done up until this point, right? Which makes him so enlightened. He freed all of the serfs that worked on the monarchical lands, right? If you were a serf that worked on the palace's lands or any land that was owned directly by the king, he freed all of those serfs and said, you are free. You are free to go, like, find another job. You are free to go move on. You are free to do what you want to do. But this is where he becomes an enlightened despot, right? So that's why we have those two words at the beginning of this definition, enlightened absolutist and enlightened despot, right? Because a despot is an intense, more Machiavellian style, more aggressive style ruler, right? Whereas the enlightened absolutist is supposed to be benevolent. So old Fritz here, the Alte Fritz, he freed monarchical serfs, but he didn't free serfs anywhere else. He actually increased the power that nobles had over their serfs and could basically increase the fact that they could basically own or like debt slave their serfs for the most of their known lives. So it's kind of an interesting thing right now. It's like, who's calling him enlightened? Well, it sounds to me like maybe some of these nobles and middle class are calling him enlightened because he's giving them more rights, but not necessarily the poor, right? He's also going to store grain for famine insurance to help prevent famines later on and stuff like that, which is going to be a big thing, which is going to help out a lot. But the famine insurance was mainly used as a last-ditch effort to keep poor people alive so they could keep working, right? So now he's also going to expand the educational system. He's going to allow free publishing of scientific and academic findings. He's going to patron philosophers and stuff like that. He's also even going to abolish the torture of prisoners, right? So something that you need to understand as well, I'm going to put something up right now, is like that's a picture of him and Voltaire walking around the palace in Prussia, right? Walking around the palace in Königsberg. He's standing there with Voltaire having a scholarly discussion, right? He patroned a lot of these philosophers and listen to a lot of their different ideas, right? Like I said, he's going to expand that idea of like the philosophers. He's going to make an immense, a library inside of his home, and he's going to abolish the torture of prisoners, which is a very big deal. Abolishing the torture of prisoners helps move like rights forward and human rights going forward for a very, very long, several number of years, right? Then the other big thing that he's going to advocate for, though, is this thing called cameralism, which is the idea that the monarchy is the best form of government. I know this is the longest thing on this slide so far, but it's still pretty important. He's advocating for the idea that the monarch is the best version of any government, right? That he thinks that basically no representatives, no legislature is needed, no Reichstag, no parliament, no parlement, none of that, right? He thinks that the absolute monarchy is the best form and that all things should go to aid the absolute monarch. In turn, the monarchy, though, should use its resources for public good, which he means he's like forcing nobles to serve in the army or as civil servants, right? Well, the thing about it, though, again, is like, yes, like I like your idea here, Frederick. I think it's a great idea that you're saying, oh, all the things go to me and I have to do good by my people. Yeah, but you can't guarantee that. And then also, legislative branches have never been a bad thing, but him, like, preventing their growth is kind of an enlightened despot thing, but his idea of being a good leader is an enlightened absolutist thing. Do you see what I'm talking about right here? It's these enlightened absolutists and despots are very, very conflicting, okay? So going into it as well, this is him right here, again, patroning Voltaire. This is him right here, introducing peasants to the potato. And we all know how people feel about potatoes, especially Katie Scuderi and how she feels about potatoes.
Potato, potato, joy. Potato time for the potato boy. Potatoes for all to enjoy. Come on and celebrate with the potato boy.
Exactly, right? So like now he's introducing the potato as a form of crop that the poor can eat because it's high in calories and it also very, very drought resistant and it's also a very hardy crop. But the other big thing about it is he's giving them potatoes so they can eat potatoes so they can grow food that he wants to eat, right? So it's a little bit of a thing. So he also had some bad things. He's going to reinforce noble power over their serfs, and he's going to restrict access to commoners to many positions, right? He basically said that, oh, if you want to work in my court and stuff like that, you still have to be a noble, whereas an enlightened absolutist would actually allow some middle class and gentry figures to rise up a little bit. So as we can see right here, a lot of these things kind of just really benefited Dale Alta Fritz there, not necessarily everybody else. Now we have another very famous ruler, right? Catherine the Great of Russia, ruler and queen of Russia, who ironically enough is not even Russian and her name's not even Catherine. Now, all right, so the big thing about it though to focus on with Catherine the Great, she's a very, very large figure of female empowerment in some ways, but not a good figure when it comes to the SES issues, right? Like, for example, she always talked about wanting to be good by her people, wanted to doing good by her people, wanted to be positive by her people, and wanted to free the serfs, but then she, like, never got around to it, you know what I'm talking about? Which is a big issue that I have, right? So the thing that we need to focus on first, though, and foremost, is that Catherine the Great, ruler of Russia, okay, the Empress of Russia, is not even Russian. She's actually German. She's from Prussia originally and stuff like that. She was a Prussian princess, and her original name was Sophie, right? And so she grew up her entire life speaking German. And her mother was a marriage of convenience from the Romanov family and was married off to the, like, actual one of the leaders of Germany, or Prussia at the time, right? Not like the king, not like Dale Alta Fritz, but a noble there, okay? And she's going to be matched up because of her, like, good noble birth and also her, like, slight relation to her cousin, Peter III, who ironically enough is also the king of Russia, but also German. Now, so like this is a very weird thing. Yes, I'm being very serious. Both of the leaders of Russia during the early 1700s are going to be German people, right? So now the thing about it though is that they take very different approaches to this, right? So Peter III is kind of vindictive about it. He doesn't really like Russia or Russian culture. He doesn't really like a lot of things that Russia provides. He doesn't like Russian food. He doesn't like Russian things. All he wants to do is play his violin and be a turd. He's a very, very arrogant, snarky, little annoying person. I don't like Peter III as a historical figure. There's actually a really good show out there on Hulu these days that actually talks a lot about their like entire relationship. It's called The Great. It's very racy. It's extremely historically inaccurate, but like it's still very funny because it kind of paints a good picture of Peter III, except he's not like as very, but he's also just really annoying. Now, Catherine didn't like him even a little bit, and she actually took a different route. She devoted herself to the Russian people and Russian culture. She apparently would stay up all night walking around the halls of the Winter Palace in her pajamas, practicing her Russian to the portraits on the walls, right? And she did this so many times that she almost got pneumonia twice because she was like in the cold and stuff like that, walking with no shoes on and everything like that, practicing her Russian so she could speak very eloquent Russian to her people. Now, Peter III spoke good Russian as well, but people in Russia began to like Catherine a lot more than they'd liked Peter. And so Peter then is going to kind of shoot himself in the foot. So there was this big war going on called the 7 Years' War, right? And we'll talk a lot about that in this unit. But the big war, the 7 Years' War, it's going to get ended by Peter because old Fritz is like somebody he kind of looked up to, right? Frederick the Great was one of the main combatants in the 7 Years' War, and he was fighting against Russia in this war, right? And against Austria. And so, well, Peter the Great's going to be like, oh, well, you know what? I'm just going to end this war because I look up to Frederick the Great. Well, that's going to alienate the army, okay? And turns out that this entire time, Catherine the Great has been cheating on her husband with army officers, right? And so one of her favorite lovers was a guy named Gregory Orlov. Gregory Orlov, her boyfriend, and the brothers then decide to throw a military coup, and they actually capture Peter, have him imprisoned, and now the only person left to rule Russia is going to be Catherine herself, aka Catherine the Great, right? And she's going to rise to power, and she's going to be a very benevolent and very intense leader in some ways, but not completely in others, right? Now, some people are going to ask a question immediately, did her and Peter have kids? And the answer is yes. They had a son, his name was Paul, all right? So, like, and they are going to raise, like, him and stuff like that. Now, interestingly enough, Paul hated his mom for how he treated his dad and stuff like that. So there's a little interesting relationship coming up there. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the thing about it, though, is now that she's a Romanov by marriage and stuff like that, it doesn't really matter in the long run because Peter was adopted by... Never mind. We're not going to do all that right now. So the thing about it, though, in general, though, is that she was kind of a student of the Enlightenment, right? A big thing that you need to understand is that as a student of the Enlightenment, she ruled in the search of three things. One, her first big thing when she became Empress of Russia is she wanted to continue to westernize Russia, a la Peter the Great, right? So she wanted to, like, not Peter the Third, Peter the Great. She wanted to make it larger. She wanted to make it grow. She wanted to make more buildings and more government structures and better things, right? She was a very big Voltaire fan as well, and she, like, patroned his arts and stuff like that. She also published the Encyclopedia by Diderot in Russia after France had banned it, and actually bought his entire library and moved it to Russia and said, look, if you want to continue to practice here freely, move to Russia. Come move over here with me, right? And so, like, as a person as well, she was like, I'm going to improve the infrastructure of Russia. So she built a canal. Well, just one. All right, so, like, now she could have been more Amsterdam about this and built a lot more, but she built one large canal to help with shipping infrastructure in St. Petersburg. She also built one of the largest collections of art that had ever been seen in Western Europe, or not in Western Europe, bigger than many in Western Europe, and it's now colloquially known as the Hermitage Museum inside of St. Petersburg. A lot of very famous artworks are actually inside of it. She also increased domestic reform. She wanted to boost the education system. She actually was the very first ruler in Russia to open schools for women, because up to this point, it was very looked down upon for a woman to even know how to read and write. But since she came out of Prussia, ruled by people like the Soldier King and Frederick the Great, she actually had learned to read, and so she wanted to improve women's educational standards as well. She limited torture, and she increased religious tolerance. See what I'm talking about here? Limit torture, possibly outlaw capital punishment, and then, like, be more religiously tolerant is kind of the go-to of all these enlightened absolutists. But a lot of this stuff was cut short. She wanted to free the serfs, she said, but she never got around to it, quote-unquote, because a lot of her reforms domestically were cut short by a very large rebellion by this guy named Emelian Pugachev, who was a guy that basically made a ragtag army of serfs and stuff like that, and tried to revolt against Catherine and overthrow her and install himself. He even claimed that he was Peter III, but by this point, Peter III had already died in prison, and he was just like, I am Peter III, I actually am still alive, I am Emelian Pugachev. And so, like, noble power is going to be increased over their serfs to prevent them from actually forming a revolting army. She even gave serfs away as gifts to people after this very large rebellion. So, ironically enough, she didn't get around to freeing the serfs because of this guy leading this revolt. Now, also, she wanted to expand and modernize Russia as much as possible, again, continuing that westernization. She improved the infrastructure system, mainly so she could collect taxes. She pushed all remaining Mongols out. She chopped up Poland along with Austria, and we'll get to a lot of that stuff more a little bit later, and we'll talk more about her in class as well, because I don't want to ruin her really good story, right? We'll talk about a lot of rumors that went around about her as well. That right there is Emelian Pugachev with his little ragtag army that tried to overthrow Catherine, and she summarily just crushed that revolt, and this revolt is going to lead to her not actually freeing the serfs like she always said she would. We'll talk more about Catherine the Great because she was the Empress of Russia during the actual, the French Revolution. So she'll come up more and more, and she's kind of in the background the entire time, right? Now, the Austrian Habsburgs are our last people that we got to talk about, okay? Now, the big thing about it, though, is the Austrian Habsburgs, not like our Habsburgs, they did have a little bit of a chin, but not an aggressive one. They were ruled over by their queen mother, right? So, like, Maria Theresa, and we'll talk a lot about her in this unit as well. Maria Theresa, her sons Joseph II and Leopold II. Now, Maria Theresa, who looks like the spitting image of Catherine the Great, but they're not the same person. Maria Theresa was the Queen of Austria, right? Her husband was actually, I think, Maximilian II, was the Holy Roman Emperor, and their child, very famously, was Marie Antoinette. So the big thing about it, though, is we're seeing a lot of these strings that you probably heard of before coming together. Now, Marie Antoinette was not her only child. Marie Antoinette was her 16th child, all right? All from the same husband. So she had 16 children, all natural births. Not all of them lived and stuff like that, but she had 16 kids, including Marie Antoinette. And the two famous ones were her sons, Joseph II and Leopold II. But just remember the name, or like Maria Theresa. Highlight her name because we'll talk a lot about her in the War of Austrian Succession. Now, because she actually had a big war with Frederick the Great and stuff like that. Now, Joseph II and Leopold II were her two sons that she raised in the ideas of the Enlightenment. She wanted to actually raise them in order to help people and like do a lot of other positive things. She also even had a census taken while actually she was raising her sons. She had house numbers put on all the numbers of the houses on the streets to standardize where everyone lived. She even had a census go out there with like census takers who actually went out and asked poor people, what is your life like living under the Habsburg monarchy? How's it going out here? What's it feel like doing this? And this is the very first time that any enlightened absolutist like a Maria Theresa had actually asked how the poor people, how their lives were, right? So it's a very, very well-received thing. Now, Joseph II, her son, her first son to rule, which is this guy right here, who's going to become another player in the next whole unit as well. Like I said, we're going to talk a lot about the Austrian Habsburgs in this unit. And so the thing about it, though, is he's going to come along after Maria Theresa dies and he becomes king, and he's going to do a lot of big things. You could say and argue that Joseph II, the Austrian Habsburg leader, the king of Austria, is the most enlightened of all the absolutists, the best of all of them, but got the least done. All right, so like now we'll talk about why that is real quick, okay? He abolished the persecution of Jewish people with the Edict of Toleration. He said no more violent crimes against Jewish people and no more like disowning them from their property and no more like actually aggressive aggressive actions towards the Jewish population. But he also said that they had to speak Hebrew only in their religious ceremonies. But that's neither here nor there. So he actually passed that large thing. Freedom of the press. He actually allowed the press to publish the things that they wanted and stuff like that. And he also controlled the Catholic Church and prevented them from actually being too heavily involved in politics. He also pushed forward a huge thing in 1781 when he actually outlawed serfdom. So he outlawed serfdom and allowed peasants to pay rents to their lords in cash. Problem was it was going to be a large backfire, and it almost had like a very large famine on their hands because there wasn't as many people to actually farm effectively. And also there was this other thing called the corvée that he never got rid of, which is like a forced labor tax. But look at what he's done. He's made life easier for the Jewish population. He has freed the serfs, and he's done freedom of the press. He is practicing the Enlightenment. But then the thing is that after he died, all those reforms were rolled back by his brother, Leo II, right? Leopold II, his brother that took over after him, who was the king of Austria during the revolution itself, is going to roll all those reforms back to make the aristocrats happy, right? Because the aristocrats got mad and aggressive, and that's why the Austrians serve as an example of the limit of the Enlightenment. Their actions were fair, but they weren't well received, and the aristocrats are going to get really, really upset and borderline throw a revolt against them, right? But we'll talk more about the Austrian Habsburgs again a little bit later on, but just remember that Joseph II is the most enlightened, but least successful. And I'm going to post a couple of videos down in the description as well, that if you want to watch them and check them out, you're more than welcome. But we're going to end that right there. That's our Enlightened Absolutists, and we'll talk a lot about some agricultural revolution stuff and a lot of other things when we get back to school on Monday. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a great one. Remember, also, quiz. Do not forget, quiz. And I'm even going to make it easy. It's not going to be stimulus-based. It's just going to be questions. Literally, I'm going to have a question up there. You just give me an answer. And that's it, okay? But y'all have a good one. I'll see y'all soon.